Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an incredibly concise yet deeply influential micronarrative. We're talking about a story based on just a few lines of text from Luke chapter 15, but man, it carries a weight and a narrative structure that has literally resonated for centuries. We're going to deconstruct the story of the lost sheep. We'll look at the math, the literal environmental stakes, and how a remarkably simple sequence of events is used to deliver this massive philosophical and theological payload. It's honestly a masterclass in storytelling efficiency, and we're about to break it down piece by piece. Okay, let's dive into this by putting ourselves inside the logic of the story. I really want you to ask yourself, what would you do if you lost a single, tiny fraction of something you owned? Imagine a portfolio, a collection, or your inventory, and you suddenly realize you're missing exactly 1% of it. Do you panic? Or do you just cut your losses and focus on the 99% that's completely safe and secure? It's a pretty basic question of risk management and human nature. And you know what? It is the exact psychological hook the story uses to pull us in.
Section 1, The Shepherd's 100, the scale of the story.
So before we can really understand the crisis, we have to establish the premise and the mathematical baseline that the source text sets up for us. 100. The narrative begins right here with this specific number. Jesus tells a story about a shepherd who possesses exactly 100 sheep. In the context of the narrative, this number represents completion. It represents wholeness. It's a substantial flock, a really solid, round number that establishes the shepherd's baseline of success and responsibility. Everything is exactly as it should be. The inventory is full. The flock is complete.
Section 2, leaving the 99, the mathematical imbalance.
Now, this is where the initial stability of that perfect 100 is suddenly broken, and the core conflict of our text is introduced. The number drops to 1. The crisis point of our story is remarkably focused. The text tells us that exactly one sheep gets lost in the mountains. Not half the flock, not a dozen, just one. And take note of the setting here, the mountains. This isn't a sheep just wandering off into a peaceful little meadow. It is lost in a rugged, highly dangerous environment. The narrative immediately introduces a serious environmental threat and pairs it with isolation. One single unit, entirely separated from the whole, in a place of acute danger. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer tension of the story. Imagine breaking this down proportionally. You've got this tiny 1% fraction representing that single lost sheep stacked up against the massive 99% of the flock that is perfectly safe. As a metaphor, this data shows us just how proportionally tiny the loss actually is. From a purely logical utilitarian standpoint, a 1% loss is a totally acceptable margin of error. Honestly, most people would look at this data and say the most rational thing to do is absolutely to protect the massive secure majority.
But the text tells us that instead of just forgetting the one lost sheep, the shepherd makes a seemingly completely illogical choice. He leaves the 99 behind. He actively steps away from the overwhelming majority of his wealth and security. This right here is the narrative pivot that makes the story so incredibly captivating. The shepherd abandons the 99% to focus entirely on the 1%. The mathematics of the story are deliberately skewed to highlight the extreme, almost unreasonable nature of the shepherd's choice.
Section 3. An all-night search, the crisis and action. Let's move to and see how this builds across the text. The story shifts from the mathematical imbalance to intense, relentless action. We start on day 1, where the sheep gets lost in the harsh environment of the mountains. By evening, the shepherd makes that dramatic decision to leave the 99. But look at the third beat. The text specifically notes that the shepherd searched all night for the missing one. The darkness of the mountains completely amplifies the danger and the stakes. It requires sheer, stubborn dedication. He doesn't wait for morning light. He pushes through the night, against the elements, until the morning when he finally achieves his goal. The narrative brilliantly uses the passage of a difficult night to prove the intensity of the search.
Section 4, Scared, Alone, and Found, the resolution.
Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is how the tense action of the all-night search finally breaks into an emotional and physical resolution. Notice the striking contrast the source text draws between our two subjects. On one side, we have the sheep. The text explicitly describes it as scared and alone. It is in a state of ultimate vulnerability. On the other side, we have the shepherd, who reacts to finding this enormous burden by rejoicing and carrying it on his shoulders. The narrative places the deep fear of the lost right next to the triumphant, joyful reaction of the rescuer. It's just a beautiful literary juxtaposition. I actually want to focus deeply on this specific physical action for a moment. The text says he carried it on his shoulders and rejoiced. I mean, think about it. After searching all night in the mountains, the shepherd would be completely exhausted. Yet he doesn't herd the sheep back. He doesn't punish it for wandering off. He physically lifts the burden onto his own shoulders. The sheer joy of the successful rescue completely overrides the physical toll of the search. The narrative uses this physical action to show a complete, total restoration of safety.
Section 5. The underlying moral, connecting the literal to the metaphorical. You see, stories like this are designed as delivery mechanisms for much larger ideas. Let's look at how the source text explicitly defines the meaning behind the shepherd's actions. So the crucial point is right here in the text's moral. Jesus never stops searching for people who are lost. As a literary explainer, this is where the cipher is fully revealed. The shepherd from the story represents Jesus, and that relentless all-night search through the mountains, it's a direct metaphor for a continuous, unending search for humanity. The narrative of the sheep is used to explain a massive theological concept, the idea of a search that simply never stops, regardless of the difficulty.
And the text actually expands on that with the second part of its moral. No matter how far you go, God still loves. Think back to the sheep wandering off into the distant, dangerous mountains. That physical, geographic distance in the story maps perfectly to this metaphorical distance. The core takeaway the text wants to impart is the absolute, unyielding persistence of that love. The distance traveled by the lost, literally no matter how extreme, cannot outpace the willingness of the searcher. We've seen how a tiny 1% loss completely defied the logic of the 99. We've seen the dark mountains, the all-night search, and the absolute joy of the rescue translated into a metaphor about relentless seeking love. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. If this kind of love searches through the dark, no matter how far you go, what does that fundamentally say about the true, immeasurable value of the one? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating narrative with me today.